This is by way of an appreciation as much as a question. Because I used to sit on your floor in Pelton Village and study with you back in 1972, maybe 71, 2.
Sure.
But in the context of this interesting statement about playfulness and the larger human canvas on which music plays, and beyond definitions and minor thirds and all, getting to that stage is the thing that so many people aspire to. And I remember when you introduced me to Nicholas Slonimsky's Thesaurus of Musical Scales and Patterns, and I thought that was, you know, the road in as much as getting to know you. And maybe that was misplaced emphasis. But I wanted just to share that, you know, no matter, well, I remember one thing, and I've told a lot of people this over the years, is that you once said to me, you know, when you get this down, you can just go out and play the Ben Franklin Bridge. You know, you can look at the architecture. I can play the buildings out there. And that, for me, was a really interesting moment.
And I guess, aside from the appreciation, what questionably comes to the forefront is, how do you do that? How do you look at something like that? And how does it become music? It comes down to the perspectives of the individual, something that cannot be just learned as a form of education, but has to be felt and has to be perceived in terms of the way you define the value in things. For instance, I said earlier about how things repeat themselves in terms of learning values. How you could see 12 notes in a scale as 12 months in a year. Or if you look at your wristwatch, if it's round-plated, round-faced, you have a chromatic scale in a circle going around your wrist on that dial. And if I see the 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock, I also see east, I see north, east, south, and west at those points. I also see that as the minor third interval in the 12-tone scale. And I also see the three that before 3 o'clock, from 12 to be January, February, and March. From 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock to be the next 3 months. From 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, the next one of the 4 seasons. And from 9 o'clock to 12 being the next one. This room, if you saw this room in a circle on a flat canvas, you would see, I'm not quite sure of our position in the city from this value point, but I know in Philadelphia, if I were sitting in my chair at my desk and you were studying with me, I would be facing east in my house, in my home, in the study. So that wall would be east, this wall would be west, that wall would be south, and that wall would be north. And then you, as a student, would say, well, what about the ceiling and the floor? What are they? And I would say the ceiling is consonance, and the floor is dissonance. It's consonance because that's where you'll see the sun. And it's dissonant because that's where you'll see darkness, the ground, where at the end of your time, you shall be buried. You see.
I can understand why studying with you was a very interesting experience.
These are perceptive definitions of numerous conditions that are repetitions of themselves in terms of a way of evaluating something that you're familiar with in so many ways that you're not familiar with. The way they manifest like a chameleon, they change colors. So these are the different studies of the different fields of endeavor that so many of us are, in a sense, drawn away from each other. In the process of learning in that way, we are dissecting the totality of the whole into so many little parts. My wife said to me something the other day that it was very profound in itself. We were watching something on PBS, And it was about the loss of certain living, for instance, honeybees are disappearing. Recently, penguins on the West Coast are very ill. And she mentioned in response, she said, well, you know, we're not of this planet. We're really alien to the planet. And I said, what do you mean when you said that? What do you mean by that? She says, well, we don't fit. We're not natural with it. We need to change it into something it isn't. And that's what's happening. We're now beginning to feel the change that the planet is beginning to refuse in that much quantity. So there are many things that we lose sight of in the process. And I think that the Slonimsky, the study of scales and intervals in that context, is a formal, it's a formal process. It's one of them. You know, not only there's Slonimsky, and there are other ones, but I think it's up to the individual as to what he or she is beginning to appreciate, to be part of all the things instead of just one being the only thing, you know. So, yes.
Do you think that's maybe why the Native Americans, the Indians, as they used to call them, lived so sweetly with nature? Like they knew those secrets of because there were plenty of fish and plenty of everything else before we got here. You know, and
that's very possible.
You know, but I mean, they seem to intuitively have that quality to live in harmony with nature and
yes.
even with the other tribes in a funny way.
Well, I can't really, I personally, I can't respond with a valid answer to your question, primarily because I'm not in a position to be able to do that. But I can say this in terms of my own experience and values that have come to the forefront. For me personally, and I've learned this from jazz more than any other form of communication to knowledge itself, the most important essence of jazz is learning how to adapt to any situation. That's the art of improvisation. To be able to improvise one's endeavors, and for them to be, for that individual to have the power, perspective power, as well as the ability to change, is similar to fluid and how it changes the shape of what it's poured into. It becomes the shape of what it's poured into. And I think that's a very valid issue. To be able to see that take place before your eyes is to be able to see alternatives and options, and not to see anything as good for you or bad for you, but to be in motion at all times through the process. And that's a learning experience, and I think that's an incredible, and I think appreciation is essential to be able to even be aware of the presence of an opportunity like that.
Isn't jazz a really good example of that? Because
it's the greatest example of that.
We do listen to each other.
Yeah, for sure. It's the greatest.